The silver blade pressed against my throat, and I could feel the cold metal drawing a thin line of blood. Above me, Alexander Ross stood with eyes that had shifted from their usual stormy gray to a terrifying crimson, his ancient power radiating through the penthouse like electricity before a storm. Three rival vampires surrounded us, their leader sneering as he tightened his grip on the weapon. This was not how I had imagined my life would change 6 months ago. Back then, I was just Sharon Gomez, a 25-year-old waitress struggling to pay rent in a city that seemed determined to crush anyone without connections or money. I had no idea that accepting a job as a personal assistant to the most powerful man in the city would lead me here, marked as the mate of the Vampire King, with enemies who wanted me dead simply because I had somehow managed to touch his frozen heart. But let me tell you how it all began, because the story of how I went from serving coffee to becoming the most protected woman in the supernatural world is one that still amazes me. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. Trust me, you are going to want to see how a fearsome vampire king who had rejected countless potential mates for over 3 centuries finally met his match in a broke waitress from Brooklyn. It started on a Tuesday night in October. I was working the late shift at Midnight Diner, a 24-hour place that attracted the kind of customers who preferred shadows to sunlight. The pay was terrible, but it was the only job I could find after my previous employer decided that my ex-boyfriend, Gary Smith, showing up drunk and threatening customers was grounds for immediate termination. Gary had been calling and texting for weeks, refusing to accept that our relationship was over, and his harassment was making it impossible for me to keep steady work. The diner was nearly empty except for a few regulars when he walked in. I noticed him immediately because men like Alexander Ross do not usually frequent places where the coffee costs $2 and the pie comes from a box. He was tall, probably 6 feet 4 inches, with perfectly styled dark hair and a face that belonged in a museum sculpture collection. His suit probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and he moved with the kind of fluid grace that made me think of predators. He chose a corner booth and ordered black coffee, nothing else. When I brought it to him, our fingers brushed as he took the cup, and I nearly dropped it. His skin was ice cold, like he had been standing outside in winter without gloves. He looked up at me with those gray eyes, and for a moment I felt like he could see straight through to my soul. That was when Gary decided to make his grand entrance. My ex-boyfriend burst through the diner door, already drunk and shouting my name. The few customers we had quickly paid their bills and left, not wanting to be part of whatever drama was about to unfold. Gary stumbled toward my section, his voice getting louder and more aggressive with each step. I'm going to be honest with you, I was scared. Gary had never hit me, but he had gotten close a few times, and I could see something different in his eyes that night. Something darker and more desperate than usual. He grabbed my wrist as I tried to walk past him to the kitchen, his grip tight enough to bruise. He started his usual routine about how I belonged to him, how I was making a mistake by leaving him, how no one else would ever want me. The words washed over me like they had a dozen times before, but this time I noticed something else. The temperature in the diner had dropped noticeably, and there was a tension in the air that made the hair on my arms stand up. I looked over at the corner booth and saw that the well-dressed stranger was watching us with an intensity that made my breath catch. His gray eyes had darkened to almost black, and he was completely motionless in a way that seemed unnatural. Gary followed my gaze and apparently decided that the stranger was somehow involved in our problems. He released my wrist and stumbled toward the corner booth, pointing an accusing finger at Alexander Ross. What happened next changed everything. Gary never made it to the table. One moment he was walking across the diner. The next he was pressed against the wall with Alexander Ross, holding him there effortlessly with one hand. I had not seen the man move. It was like he had simply appeared behind Gary in the space between heartbeats. Gary was not a small man, but Alexander Ross held him against the wall like he weighed nothing. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and controlled, but there was something in it that made my skin crawl with primitive fear. He told Gary that he would leave the diner immediately and never contact me again. He said it only once, but Gary nodded frantically and practically ran out the door when Alexander Ross released him. I stood there staring, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The stranger returned to his booth like nothing had happened, but I noticed that he left a $100 bill on the table for a $2 cup of coffee. When I tried to thank him, he was already gone. I did not see him again for 2 weeks, but Gary kept his word. The calls and texts stopped completely, and for the first time in months, I could walk to work without constantly looking over my shoulder. I assumed that was the end of it, that some wealthy businessman had done a good deed and moved on with his life. I was working another late shift when Alexander Ross came back. This time, he did not order coffee. He slid into the same corner booth and waited until my section was empty before he spoke. He told me his name and said he had a proposition for me. He needed a personal assistant, someone who could work unconventional hours and handle confidential matters with discretion. The pay was more than I had ever dreamed of making, enough to cover my rent and student loans with money left over for actual groceries instead of ramen noodles. There was something about the way he presented the offer that made it clear this was not really a choice. He knew things about my situation that he should not have known. He knew about my student debt, my eviction notice, my mother's medical bills that I had been trying to help with. He knew that I was desperate enough to accept almost any legitimate job offer. But he also made it clear that this position would require complete loyalty and discretion. He said there were aspects of his business that most people would not understand, and that once I accepted the job, there would be no going back to my old life. I should have asked more questions. I should have been suspicious of a stranger who knew so much about my personal finances and offered solutions that seemed too good to be true. But when you are 3 weeks behind on rent and living on peanut butter sandwiches, you do not look gift horses in the mouth. I accepted his offer that night. The next evening, a car arrived to take me to Alexander Ross's building. Not just any building, but a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the most expensive part of the city. The penthouse took up the entire top floor, and when the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a world that felt like it belonged in a different century. The apartment was decorated with antiques that looked genuinely ancient, not reproduction pieces from expensive stores. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and the walls were lined with books that appeared to be first editions. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the entire city, but heavy curtains were drawn across them despite the late hour. Alexander Ross was waiting for me in what he called his study, wearing another perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than my car. He gestured for me to sit in a leather chair across from his massive oak desk, and then he began to explain what my duties would entail. I would be responsible for managing his schedule, handling correspondence, and coordinating meetings with various business associates. Most of my work would take place during evening and overnight hours, as he preferred to conduct business after sunset. I would have access to a company credit card for expenses, and my salary would be deposited directly into my bank account each week. It all sounded straightforward enough, but there were rules, strict rules that he presented as non-negotiable terms of employment. I was never to enter certain areas of the penthouse without permission. I was never to ask questions about the nature of his business meetings or the identities of his associates. I was to maintain complete confidentiality about everything I saw and heard while in his employ. And most importantly, I was never to be in the building during daylight hours. He handed me a contract that was longer and more complex than anything I had ever signed, full of legal language that I did not completely understand. There were clauses about confidentiality agreements and penalties for breach of contract that seemed excessive for a personal assistant position. But the salary figure at the bottom was real, and it was enough to change my life. I signed the papers that night. My first few weeks working for Alexander Ross were surprisingly normal. I answered phones, scheduled appointments, and organized files. His business associates were an eclectic group of people who all seemed to prefer meeting late at night. But I had worked enough service jobs to know that rich people often had unusual schedules. The only strange thing was that I never saw Alexander Ross eat or drink anything except water. He would have elaborate meals delivered for his guests, but he never touched the food himself. When I asked about it, he simply said he had dietary restrictions. I also noticed that he never seemed to sleep. No matter how early I arrived or how late I stayed, he was always awake and alert. His energy never flagged, and he never showed any signs of fatigue even during marathon business sessions that lasted until dawn. But the strangest thing was the way other people reacted to him. Business partners who were clearly powerful and wealthy in their own right treated him with a deference that bordered on fear. They spoke to him like he was royalty, using formal language and waiting for permission before sitting or speaking. More than once, I saw grown men practically bow when they entered his presence. I started to suspect that Alexander Ross was involved in something more complex than traditional business, but the money was too good to walk away from, and he had never been anything but professional with me. He was demanding but fair, and he seemed to genuinely appreciate competent work. Everything changed the night I stayed late to finish organizing files and accidentally discovered what Alexander Ross really was. I was working in the outer office when I heard voices from his private study. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see two men sitting across from his desk. They were discussing something about territory and feeding rights, using terms that made no sense in any business context I could imagine. Then one of the men stood up, and I saw his eyes flash red in the lamplight. Not reflecting light like an animal's eyes, but actually glowing with their own crimson illumination. He moved toward the window with inhuman speed, crossing the room in a blur of motion that my brain struggled to process. I must have made some sound of surprise, because Alexander Ross's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. He called my name and asked me to join them in the study. There was something in his tone that made it clear this was not a request. I entered the room on unsteady legs, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I had witnessed. The two men were watching me with expressions that ranged from curious to hungry, and I had the sudden, terrifying realization that I was in serious danger. Alexander Ross stood behind his desk, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked genuinely concerned. He told his associates that the meeting was over and that they should leave immediately. They protested, saying something about loose ends and security risks, but he cut them off with a look that made them both step backward. After they left, Alexander Ross and I were alone in the study. The silence stretched between us until I finally found my voice and asked the question that I already knew the answer to. He confirmed what I had suspected. He was not human. Neither were the men who had just left, or most of the people I had been scheduling appointments with for the past month. I had been working for the Vampire King of the East Coast Territory, managing his schedule and coordinating meetings with other supernatural beings who recognized his authority. I should have been terrified. I should have run screaming from the building and never looked back. Instead, I found myself asking practical questions about how vampire politics worked and whether I needed to adjust his calendar to account for supernatural business practices. Alexander Ross stared at me for a long moment, and then he did something I had never seen before. He smiled. Not the polite, professional expression he wore during business meetings, but a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He told me that in 300 years of existence, I was the first human who had discovered his true nature and responded with curiosity instead of terror. Most people either fainted, screamed, or tried to run. I had asked about his schedule. That was the night everything changed between us. Alexander Ross explained that knowing his secret put me in an impossible position. Vampire law required that humans who discovered their existence either be killed or bound to silence through supernatural means. Since he had no intention of harming me, and since I had proven myself valuable and trustworthy, he was prepared to offer me a different arrangement. He could mark me as his protected human, which would place me under his personal protection, but also make me his responsibility in the eyes of vampire society. It would mean that I could never leave his service, never reveal what I knew, and never have a normal human life. But it would also mean that I would be safe from other vampires who might see me as a threat, and I would be compensated far beyond what any human assistant had ever received. The alternative was to have my memories of everything supernatural erased and return to my old life. But he warned me that the process was not perfect. I might lose other memories as well, and there was no guarantee that I would be able to rebuild my life successfully. I asked for time to think about it, and he agreed to give me until the following evening to decide. I went home to my tiny apartment and tried to process everything I had learned. Alexander Ross was a vampire. Not just any vampire, but apparently one of the most powerful vampires in North America. The man who had saved me from my abusive ex-boyfriend, who had given me a job that pulled me out of poverty, who had been nothing but professional and respectful in all our interactions, was a centuries-old predator who could kill me without breaking a sweat. But here is the thing that kept me awake all day. In the months I had been working for him, I had never felt safer. Alexander Ross had never made me uncomfortable, never crossed professional boundaries, never made me feel like I was in danger. Even when he was conducting business with other vampires who clearly saw me as potential prey, he had made it clear that I was under his protection. I thought about Gary and how Alexander Ross had handled that situation. I thought about the way he spoke to me, always polite and considerate, never condescending or dismissive. I thought about the way other vampires deferred to him, and how he used that power to protect rather than intimidate. I made my decision before sunset. When I returned to the penthouse that evening, I told Alexander Ross that I accepted his offer. I wanted to stay and learn about this hidden world that existed alongside the human one. I wanted to continue working for him, and not just because the money was good, but because I genuinely respected him as an employer, and if I was being honest with myself, as a person. The marking ceremony was not what I expected. I had imagined something dramatic and painful, but it was surprisingly gentle. Alexander Ross explained that he would need to bite me, just enough to draw blood and create a psychic connection between us. The mark would be invisible to humans, but unmistakable to other vampires. He asked for my consent 3 times before he proceeded, making sure I understood that this was permanent and irreversible. When I confirmed that I was ready, he moved behind my chair and gently brushed my hair away from my neck. The bite itself was quick and sharp, like a needle prick, followed by a strange warmth that spread through my entire body. For a moment, I could swear I felt his emotions as clearly as my own. Loneliness that stretched back centuries, carefully controlled hunger, and underneath it all, a fierce protectiveness that took my breath away. When it was over, Alexander Ross stepped back and told me that the bond was complete. I was now marked as his protected human, and any vampire who threatened me would answer to him personally. What he did not tell me was that the mark would also allow me to sense his emotions and occasionally hear his thoughts. I discovered this gradually over the following weeks as I began to understand that the vampire king who terrified other supernatural beings was, in many ways, profoundly lonely. Alexander Ross had been turned during the Revolutionary War when he was a young soldier fighting for American independence. He had spent the past 3 centuries building power and territory, but he had never found a companion who could understand both his human and vampire natures. He had rejected countless potential mates, both human and vampire, because none of them had been able to see past his power to the man underneath. Through our psychic connection, I began to understand that his fearsome reputation was as much armor as it was truth. He was capable of terrible violence when necessary, but he took no pleasure in it. He ruled through strength because vampire society respected nothing else, but he used that strength to protect those under his care rather than to dominate them. I also learned that having a marked human was extremely unusual for a vampire of his status. Most vampire kings took other vampires as mates, forming political alliances that strengthened their positions. By choosing to protect a human instead of pursuing a strategic marriage, Alexander Ross was making himself vulnerable to challenges from rivals who saw his attachment to me as weakness. I did not fully understand the implications of this until the night Henry Wilson came to call. Henry Wilson was Alexander Ross's younger brother, turned at the same time but always resentful of Alexander's position as the elder and more powerful vampire. He had been building support among the old guard vampires who believed that humans were nothing more than food sources, and that any vampire who showed them consideration was weak. Henry arrived at the penthouse with 2 other vampires, ostensibly for a family visit, but actually to assess whether Alexander's attachment to me had made him vulnerable enough to challenge. I was working late in the outer office when they arrived, and I could hear their conversation through the study door. Henry was arguing that Alexander's protection of a human was making other vampires question his fitness to rule. He claimed that several territorial leaders were considering switching their allegiance to a king who would uphold traditional vampire values instead of coddling humans. Alexander's response was quiet but deadly. He told his brother that any vampire who wished to challenge his authority was welcome to do so, but they should be prepared for the consequences. He had not maintained his position for 3 centuries by being weak, and he would not be giving it up now. The conversation escalated until Henry made a direct threat against me, suggesting that removing the source of Alexander's distraction would solve everyone's problems. That was when I learned exactly how protective Alexander Ross could be. The temperature in the penthouse dropped so quickly that I could see my breath. Through our psychic connection, I felt Alexander's rage like a physical force, cold and implacable, and absolutely terrifying. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries of absolute power. He told Henry that I was under his personal protection and that any vampire who threatened me would face him in formal combat. He reminded his brother that he had never lost a challenge and that he had no intention of starting now. Henry and his companions left without another word, but I could see in their expressions that this was not over. They would be back, and next time they would come prepared for war. After Henry Wilson left, Alexander Ross came to find me in the outer office. I was still shaking from the psychic echo of his rage, and he could obviously sense my fear through our bond. He sat down across from me and explained that I was now in serious danger. By marking me as his protected human, he had made me a target for any vampire who wanted to challenge his authority. Henry Wilson and his faction saw me as Alexander's weakness, and they would try to use me against him. The safest thing would be for me to leave the city immediately, but even then there was no guarantee that they would not track me down. I asked him what the alternative was, and his answer surprised me. He said that I could stay and fight beside him. The old vampire laws included provisions for humans who proved themselves worthy of vampire protection through trial by combat. If I could survive the challenges that Henry Wilson's faction would inevitably present, I would be recognized as Alexander's equal partner rather than just his protected human. The idea was insane. I was a 25-year-old waitress from Brooklyn with no combat training and no supernatural abilities. How was I supposed to survive vampire trials that had been designed to test creatures with superhuman strength and speed? But Alexander Ross had a plan. The trials were not just about physical combat. They also tested intelligence, loyalty, and the ability to navigate vampire politics. He believed that my human perspective and natural problem-solving abilities would be assets rather than weaknesses. He also revealed something that changed everything. The psychic bond we shared was stronger than typical vampire marks. Over time, it would grant me some of his abilities. I would never be as strong or fast as a vampire, but I would be enhanced beyond normal human limits. More importantly, I would be able to sense other vampires' intentions and emotions, giving me an advantage in political situations. I had 24 hours to decide whether to flee or stay and fight. Alexander made it clear that he would respect either choice, but I could see in his eyes that he hoped I would stay. Through our bond, I felt something that I had never experienced from him before: hope mixed with genuine affection. I realized that somewhere in the past few months, I had fallen in love with the Vampire King. Not because of his power or wealth, but because of his fundamental decency. He was a man who had been given every reason to become a monster, but who had chosen to use his strength to protect rather than destroy. I told him I would stay and face whatever trials Henry Wilson wanted to present. The next few weeks were intensive training. Alexander taught me vampire politics, showing me how to read the subtle power dynamics that govern supernatural society. He explained the formal rules of challenge and trial, and how humans had historically proven themselves worthy of vampire acceptance. But more than that, he taught me how to use our psychic bond as a weapon. I learned to project confidence and determination even when I was terrified, and to sense the emotional weaknesses of potential opponents. I discovered that many vampires were so accustomed to dealing with the other supernatural beings that they underestimated humans, and that this blind spot could be exploited. I also learned more about Alexander's past and why he had remained unmated for so long. He had tried to form partnerships with other vampires, but they had all been more interested in his power than in him as an individual. He had grown tired of relationships that were based on political advantage rather than genuine connection. With me, he said, he could be himself rather than just the Vampire King. I saw him as Alexander first and Vampire second, and that made all the difference. The night of the first trial, Henry Wilson arrived with a formal challenge delegation. According to vampire law, I would face 3 tests: a trial of intelligence, a trial of loyalty, and a trial of combat. If I passed all 3, I would be recognized as Alexander's equal partner and granted the protection of vampire law. If I failed any of them, Henry Wilson would have the right to challenge Alexander for leadership of the territory. The trial of intelligence was a complex negotiation scenario involving multiple vampire factions with competing interests. I had to find a solution that satisfied everyone while maintaining Alexander's authority. It took 6 hours of careful diplomacy, but I managed to craft an agreement that actually strengthened Alexander's position while giving the other factions what they needed. The trial of loyalty was more personal. I was presented with a choice between saving my own life and protecting Alexander from an assassin. The scenario was staged, but the emotions were real. I threw myself between Alexander and a silver blade without hesitation, and the psychic bond between us flared so brightly that everyone in the room could feel it. But it was the trial of combat that nearly killed me. My opponent was Samantha Turner, a vampire who had been turned during the Civil War and had spent the past century and a half perfecting her fighting skills. She was faster, stronger, and more experienced than me in every possible way. The only advantages I had were my human unpredictability and the enhanced abilities I had gained through my bond with Alexander. The fight took place in the penthouse's main room, with representatives from every major vampire faction watching. Samantha Turner moved like liquid death, her attacks coming so fast that I could barely track them. But through my bond with Alexander, I could sense her intentions a split second before she acted, giving me just enough warning to dodge or counter. The battle lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours. I was bleeding from a dozen cuts. My left arm was probably broken, and I was running on pure adrenaline and determination. But I was still standing, and Samantha Turner was beginning to show signs of frustration. That was when I realized something important. Samantha Turner was fighting like a vampire, relying on speed and strength to overwhelm her opponent. But I was fighting like a human, using strategy and adaptability to survive. She expected me to fight her kind of fight, but I was playing by different rules. I started using the environment to my advantage, forcing her to chase me around furniture and through doorways where her supernatural speed was less effective. I grabbed improvised weapons, threw obstacles in her path, and generally made myself as difficult to catch as possible. Finally, I managed to get behind her and wrap a silver chain around her throat. It was not enough to kill her, but it was enough to force her to yield. According to the rules of trial by combat, I had won. The room erupted in surprise murmurs. No one had expected the human to survive, let alone win. Henry Wilson looked like he wanted to challenge the results, but vampire law was clear. I had passed all 3 trials, and I was now recognized as Alexander's equal partner. But Henry Wilson was not finished with us yet. 3 weeks after the trials, Henry Wilson made his move. He had been building alliances with vampire factions from other territories, promising them shares of Alexander's domain if they supported his bid for power. What we did not know was that he had also been working with Megan Wilson, a vampire from the West Coast, who had her own reasons for wanting Alexander destroyed. Megan Wilson had been Alexander's mate over a century ago, but their relationship had ended badly when she chose political ambition over their bond. She had never forgiven him for moving on without her, and she saw his partnership with me as the ultimate insult. A human had taken the place that she believed rightfully belonged to her. The attack came at dawn when Alexander was at his weakest. Vampires could function during daylight hours, but they were significantly less powerful than they were at night. Henry Wilson and his allies had planned their assault carefully, timing it for maximum advantage. I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass as vampires crashed through the penthouse windows. Alexander was beside me instantly, moving faster than I had ever seen him despite the daylight weakness. He threw me behind the bed and told me to stay hidden while he dealt with the intruders. But there were too many of them. Henry Wilson had brought 8 vampires, all of them ancient and powerful. Even at full strength, Alexander would have been hard-pressed to fight them all. Weakened by the sun, he was at a severe disadvantage. I watched through our psychic bond as he fought with desperate skill, trying to protect me while battling opponents who were trying to kill us both. He managed to destroy 3 of them before Megan Wilson appeared behind him with a silver blade. The knife went into his back between the shoulder blades, and I felt his pain as clearly as if it were my own. He stumbled, his supernatural speed faltering, and Henry Wilson saw his chance. He grabbed me from my hiding place and pressed a silver knife to my throat. That was the moment I described at the beginning of this story. Alexander Ross, the fearsome vampire king, brought to his knees by his love for a human who should have meant nothing to him. Henry Wilson demanding that Alexander submit to him or watch me die. But Henry Wilson had made a critical error. He assumed that marking me as his protected human had made Alexander weak. What he did not understand was that it had also made me strong. The psychic bond between Alexander and me was not just a connection. It was a conduit. Through it, I had access to some of his vampiric abilities, but he also had access to something that vampires had lost long ago: human determination and the willingness to sacrifice everything for love. I felt Alexander's power flowing through our bond, and I realized that I was not as helpless as Henry Wilson believed. The trials had changed me, strengthening abilities I had not known I possessed. I was not fully human anymore, but I was not vampire either. I was something new, something that vampire law had not accounted for. I grabbed Henry Wilson's wrist and twisted with strength that surprised both of us. The silver blade flew across the room, and I rolled away from him before he could recover. But more importantly, I had given Alexander the opening he needed. The Vampire King rose to his feet with his eyes blazing crimson fire. The silver knife in his back had not been enough to kill him, and now he was angry. Not just angry, but furious in a way that made the air itself seem to vibrate with power. What followed was not a fight, it was an execution. Alexander Ross moved through Henry Wilson's remaining allies like death incarnate. His brother tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. In less than 2 minutes, every vampire who had dared to threaten me was dead, their bodies turning to ash in the morning sunlight. Henry Wilson was the last to die, and Alexander made sure he understood exactly why he was being destroyed. He had threatened Alexander's mate, and that was an unforgivable crime. When it was over, Alexander collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. The silver knife had done more damage than he had initially let on, and the daylight was sapping his remaining strength. I managed to get him to his bedroom and close the heavy curtains, but I could feel through our bond that he was dying. That was when I made the most important decision of my life. I opened the silver blade and cut my own wrist, pressing it to Alexander's lips. Human blood could heal vampires, but the blood of a bonded mate was especially powerful. I felt my life force flowing into him, strengthening him, pulling him back from the edge of death. But something else happened as well. The bond between us deepened and changed, becoming something that neither of us had expected. I was still human, but I was also something more. Alexander was still vampire, but he was also something different than he had been before. We had become true partners in every sense of the word. The aftermath of Henry Wilson's attack changed everything in the vampire world. Word spread quickly that the Vampire King of the East Coast had not only survived a coordinated assassination attempt, but had done so with the help of his human mate. I had proven that humans could be more than just prey or servants, that we could be genuine partners to vampires who were willing to see us as equals. Alexander's position was stronger than ever. The other territorial leaders who had been considering supporting Henry Wilson's rebellion quickly pledged their renewed loyalty. No one wanted to face a vampire king who had the backing of a mate who could think strategically and fight effectively. But the most significant change was in Alexander himself. For 3 centuries, he had ruled through fear and intimidation, keeping himself isolated to maintain his power. Now he had someone who knew all of his vulnerabilities and loved him anyway. The loneliness that had defined his existence was finally gone. We established new rules for the territory, ones that recognized humans as potential allies rather than just resources. Vampires who wanted to mark human mates had to prove that the relationship was consensual and beneficial to both parties. Humans who discovered vampire existence could choose to join our world rather than being automatically killed or having their memories erased. I became something unprecedented in vampire society: a human queen, not through transformation, but through partnership. I retained my humanity while gaining abilities that allowed me to function effectively in the supernatural world. Other vampires respected me not because I was Alexander's mate, but because I had earned my position through trials and combat. The penthouse became our shared domain, a place where vampire politics and human sensibilities coexisted. I continued to manage Alexander's business affairs, but now I also served as an ambassador between the human and vampire worlds. We developed systems for protecting humans who became involved with vampires, and for helping vampires who wanted to integrate more fully into modern society. But perhaps most importantly, we found happiness together. Alexander taught me about vampire history and culture, sharing centuries of memories and experiences. I showed him how to appreciate human art in music and literature, helping him connect with the mortal world in ways he had forgotten. Our love story became legendary in vampire circles. The fearsome vampire king who had rejected countless potential mates had finally found his equal in a human waitress from Brooklyn. It proved that love could transcend species boundaries, that power was not always about domination, and that sometimes the strongest partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than supernatural bonds. The psychic connection between us deepened over time, allowing us to communicate without words and share emotions as if they were our own. But we also maintained our individual identities, supporting each other without losing ourselves in the relationship. I learned to navigate vampire politics with the same skill I had once used to manage difficult customers at the diner. Alexander learned to appreciate the simple human pleasures he had forgotten during his centuries of isolation. Together, we created something new, a partnership that honored both our natures while transcending the limitations of either. 6 months after Henry Wilson's attack, we faced our first major challenge as equal partners. Megan Wilson had survived the assault and fled to Europe, where she was building support for another attempt at Alexander's territory. This time, she was not relying on vampire allies alone. She had made contact with vampire hunters, humans who specialized in killing supernatural beings. The irony was not lost on either of us. A vampire was working with vampire hunters to destroy the vampire king who had chosen to protect and love a human. It was a perfect example of how prejudice and jealousy could corrupt even the most unlikely alliances. But we were ready for her. The trials and battles we had already survived had taught us to work together as a team, combining Alexander's supernatural abilities with my human strategic thinking. We had allies among both vampires and humans, and we had something that Megan Wilson would never understand: a love built on genuine partnership rather than possessive obsession. The final confrontation took place in the abandoned warehouse district where I had first learned to fight vampires during my training. Megan Wilson arrived with 6 vampire hunters armed with silver weapons and holy water, confident that her human allies would give her the advantage she needed. She had not counted on the fact that I was no longer the helpless human she remembered from Alexander's past. The trials had changed me, and months of partnership with Alexander had enhanced my abilities even further. I was faster, stronger, and more resilient than any normal human, but I still retained the unpredictability that made humans dangerous to vampires who underestimated them. The battle was fierce but brief. The vampire hunters discovered that their weapons were less effective against a vampire who had a human partner watching his back. I could sense their tactics and warn Alexander of attacks he might not have seen coming. Meanwhile, Alexander's supernatural speed and strength made short work of opponents who were accustomed to fighting vampires alone. Megan Wilson herself proved to be a more challenging opponent than I expected. She was older and more experienced than Samantha Turner, and she fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. But she also fought with the jealousy and rage that had consumed her for over a century, and those emotions made her predictable. I managed to get behind her while Alexander kept her distracted, and I pressed a silver cross to the back of her neck. It was not enough to kill her, but it was enough to paralyze her long enough for Alexander to finish the fight. As Megan Wilson turned to ash, I felt a sense of closure that I had not expected. This was the last major threat to our partnership, the final challenge to Alexander's right to choose love over political convenience. We had proven that our bond was stronger than jealousy, stronger than prejudice, and stronger than the traditions that said vampires and humans could never be equals. A year after I first walked into Alexander Ross's penthouse as his human assistant, I stood in the same room as his recognized queen and equal partner. The transformation had been gradual but profound, changing not just my circumstances, but my entire understanding of what was possible. The vampire world had accepted me in ways that I never could have imagined. Other territorial leaders sought my advice on human relations, and young vampires who wanted to form partnerships with humans came to learn from our example. I had become a bridge between two worlds that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for centuries. But the most important change was in my relationship with Alexander. What had begun as a professional arrangement born of desperation had evolved into a love story that neither of us had expected. We were partners in every sense of the word, sharing power and responsibility equally, while maintaining the individual strengths that made us effective together. The penthouse had become our sanctuary, a place where the vampire king could be simply Alexander and where the human queen could be simply Sharon. We had created a life together that honored both our natures while transcending the limitations that others tried to impose on us. I still marveled sometimes at the journey that had brought me here. A year ago, I had been a broke waitress running from an abusive ex-boyfriend with no prospects and no hope for a better future. Now I was the most protected woman in the supernatural world, with abilities I had never dreamed of and a love that had already become legendary. The psychic bond between Alexander and me had stabilized into something beautiful and complex. We could share thoughts and emotions when we chose to, but we also maintained our privacy when we needed it. The connection enhanced our partnership without overwhelming our individual identities. I had learned to use vampire politics to protect humans who found themselves involved with supernatural beings. Alexander had learned to appreciate human creativity and adaptability in ways that enriched his ancient existence. Together, we were stronger than either of us could have been alone. The business of ruling a vampire territory turned out to be surprisingly similar to managing a complex organization, with the added complications of supernatural abilities and ancient grudges. I applied the customer service skills I had learned in restaurants and retail to vampire diplomacy and discovered that many of the same principles applied. Listen to what people actually need, find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems, and never underestimate the power of treating others with genuine respect. Alexander's reputation evolved from fearsome isolation to protective leadership. Other vampires still respected his power, but they also began to trust his judgment in ways they never had before. Having a human partner who could offer different perspectives on problems made him a more effective leader, not a weaker one. We established the first vampire human council in North America, with representatives from both communities working together to address the challenges of coexistence. It was not always easy, but it was always worthwhile. We were creating something new and important, a model for how different species could work together rather than simply coexisting in mutual fear. I never forgot where I came from or the life I had left behind. The struggles of being human in a world that often seemed designed to crush anyone without power or connections had taught me empathy and resilience that served me well in my new role. I used my position to help other humans who found themselves in desperate situations, just as Alexander had once helped me. But I also never forgot that I had chosen this life freely. Alexander had given me options and respected my decision, even when it put him at risk. That foundation of mutual respect and consent made all the difference in how our relationship developed. The vampire world was changing because of our partnership, becoming more open to the possibility that humans could be allies rather than just prey. Young vampires who had grown up in isolation were learning that they did not have to choose between their supernatural nature and meaningful connections with others. I had become living proof that love could transcend species boundaries, that power shared was power multiplied, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships created the strongest bonds. As I stood in the penthouse that had become our shared domain, looking out at the city that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. It had not been easy, and it had required me to discover strength I had not known I possessed. But it had been worth every challenge, every trial, every moment of fear and uncertainty. I had found not just love, but partnership, not just security, but purpose, not just acceptance, but the power to create change in a world that desperately needed but the fearsome vampire king who had rejected countless potential mates for over 3 centuries had finally found his match in a human who saw past his power to the man underneath. And in doing so, we had both discovered that the strongest bonds were built not on dominance or submission, but on mutual respect, genuine affection, and the willingness to fight for each other when the world tried to tear us apart. The evening Alexander Ross first walked into Midnight Diner, I had been contemplating whether I could afford to eat anything other than ramen noodles for the rest of the month. Tonight, as I prepared for a formal dinner with the Vampire Council of North America, I wore a gown that cost more than I used to make in a year. But the most profound change was not in my circumstances. It was in my understanding of what it meant to be truly powerful. Power, I had learned, was not about domination or fear. It was about the ability to protect what you loved, to create positive change in the world, and to build bridges where others saw only walls. Alexander had taught me that true strength came from restraint, from choosing when and how to use your abilities rather than simply overwhelming your opponents. I had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, that opening your heart to another person required more courage than any physical battle. Together, we had discovered that the strongest partnerships were built on complementary strengths rather than identical abilities. The Vampire Council meeting was a formal recognition of what had already become reality. Our territory was the most stable and prosperous in North America, with the lowest rates of vampire-human conflict and the highest levels of cooperation between species. Other territorial leaders wanted to understand how we had achieved what they had thought impossible. The answer was surprisingly simple. We had treated each other as equals from the beginning, even when the power imbalance between us seemed insurmountable. Alexander had never used his supernatural abilities to coerce or intimidate me, and I had never tried to manipulate his feelings to gain advantages. We had built trust through consistency, respect, and genuine care for each other's well-being. The council formally recognized me as Alexander's equal partner and co-ruler of the East Coast Territory. It was a precedent-setting decision that would change vampire society for generations to come. For the first time in recorded vampire history, a human had been granted full political authority in the supernatural world. But the ceremony itself was less important than what it represented. We had proven that love could transcend species boundaries, that power could be shared rather than hoarded, and that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships created the strongest foundations for change. After the formal proceedings, Alexander and I returned to our penthouse for a private celebration. As we stood together on the balcony overlooking the city, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. A year and a half ago, I had been a frightened waitress with an abusive ex-boyfriend and no prospects for a better future. Now I was the co-ruler of the most powerful vampire territory in North America, with abilities I had never dreamed of and a love that had already changed the supernatural world. The transformation had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty. There had been trials that nearly killed me and battles that tested every ounce of strength I possessed. But there had also been moments of profound joy, discovery, and connection that made every challenge worthwhile. Alexander had changed as well. The lonely, isolated vampire king who had ruled through fear and intimidation had become a partner and protector who used his power to create rather than destroy. He had learned to trust again, to open his heart to love, and to find strength in vulnerability. Our bond had deepened over time into something that neither of us had expected. We were still individuals with our own thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, but we were also partners in the truest sense of the word. We supported each other without losing ourselves, challenged each other without undermining our relationship, and loved each other without conditions or reservations. The psychic connection between us had stabilized into a beautiful form of intimacy that enhanced our partnership without overwhelming our individual identities. We could share emotions and thoughts when we chose to, but we also maintained our privacy and independence. The bond was a bridge between us, not a chain that bound us together. I had retained my humanity while gaining abilities that allowed me to function effectively in the supernatural world. Alexander had retained his vampiric nature while rediscovering the human emotions he had thought lost forever. Together, we had created something new, a partnership that honored both our natures while transcending the limitations of either. The vampire world was changing because of our example. Young vampires who had grown up believing that they had to choose between their supernatural nature and meaningful relationships were discovering that they could have both. Humans who found themselves involved with vampires were learning that they did not have to sacrifice their identity or agency to find love and protection. We had established programs to help humans who discovered vampire existence, giving them choices beyond death or memory erasure. We had created support systems for vampires who wanted to form genuine partnerships with humans rather than simply marking them as property. We had built bridges between communities that had been separated by fear and misunderstanding for centuries. But perhaps most importantly, we had proven that love was stronger than prejudice, that partnership was more powerful than domination, and that sometimes the most unlikely combinations created the most beautiful results. As I stood in Alexander's arms, looking out at the city that had once seemed so hostile and unforgiving, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us together. It had not been the life I had planned or expected, but it had been exactly the life I needed. The fearsome vampire king who had spent 3 centuries rejecting potential mates had finally found his perfect partner in a human who had the courage to see past his reputation to the man underneath. And in finding each other, we had both discovered that the strongest love stories were not about changing for someone else, but about becoming the best version of yourself through partnership with someone who truly understood and valued who you were. 2 years after that first night at Midnight Diner, I found myself preparing for what would become known as the Treaty of New York, the first formal agreement between vampire and human governments. As Alexander's co-ruler and the first human to achieve equal status in vampire society, I would be representing both communities in negotiations that would shape the future of human-vampire relations. The treaty talks had been my idea, born from the recognition that the supernatural world could no longer remain completely hidden from human authorities. Too many humans were discovering vampire existence, and too many vampires were choosing to form relationships with humans for the old system of secrecy and intimidation to remain viable. Alexander had initially been skeptical of the idea. 3 centuries of vampire tradition emphasized the importance of remaining hidden from human governments, which were seen as too unstable and short-sighted to be trusted with supernatural secrets. But I had convinced him that controlled revelation was better than accidental exposure, and that establishing formal diplomatic relations would benefit both communities. The negotiations took place in a neutral location, a private conference center that had been specially prepared for supernatural security requirements. Representatives from 12 vampire territories attended, along with carefully selected human officials who had been briefed on the existence of vampires and sworn to secrecy. I served as the primary liaison between the two groups, translating vampire concerns into terms that human officials could understand and helping vampires navigate the complexities of modern human politics. It was challenging work that required all of the diplomatic skills I had developed over the past 2 years, but it was also deeply satisfying. The final treaty established formal recognition of vampire territories within human nations, created protocols for handling humans who discovered vampire existence, and set up joint task forces to address problems that affected both communities. It was not perfect, but it was a beginning. More importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how vampires and humans related to each other. Instead of predator and prey, we were becoming partners in managing shared challenges. Instead of fear and secrecy, we were building trust and cooperation. Alexander's role in the negotiations was crucial. His reputation as a powerful but fair leader gave other vampires confidence that the treaty would not disadvantage them, while his partnership with me demonstrated that vampire-human cooperation was not only possible but beneficial. He had become a symbol of how the vampire world could evolve while maintaining its essential nature. The treaty signing ceremony was held at our penthouse, with representatives from both communities witnessing the historic agreement. As I signed my name to the document, I reflected on how far we had all come from the night when a desperate waitress had accepted a job offer from a mysterious stranger. But the treaty was just the beginning of a new phase in our relationship and our work. As the first recognized vampire-human diplomatic partnership, Alexander and I were setting precedents that would influence supernatural politics for generations to come. We established the first integrated vampire-human security force, with teams of both species working together to address threats that neither could handle alone. We created educational programs to help vampires understand modern human society and to help humans who became involved with vampires navigate the supernatural world safely. Most importantly, we continued to serve as an example of what was possible when two very different beings chose to build a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. Our personal relationship had deepened and matured over the years. The initial intensity of our bond had settled into something more sustainable but no less profound. We had learned to balance our individual needs with our shared responsibilities, and to support each other through the challenges of leadership without losing our distinct identities. The psychic connection between us had become a source of strength and comfort rather than overwhelming intensity. We could share thoughts and emotions when we wanted to, but we had also learned to maintain our privacy when we needed it. The bond enhanced our partnership without defining it completely. I had grown into my role as a leader in ways that sometimes surprised me. The frightened waitress who had once been afraid to stand up to an abusive ex-boyfriend had become a confident diplomat who could negotiate with ancient vampires and human officials with equal skill. But I had never lost the empathy and resiliences that had carried me through my darkest moments. Alexander had also evolved in ways that amazed both of us. The isolated vampire king who had ruled through fear and intimidation had become a collaborative leader who sought input from others and built consensus rather than simply issuing commands. He had rediscovered his capacity for joy, humor, and hope without losing the strength that made him an effective protector. Together, we had created something unprecedented, a true partnership between equals who happened to belong to different species. We had proven that love could transcend biological boundaries, that power could be shared rather than hoarded, and that the strongest relationships were built on mutual growth rather than static compatibility. The vampire world had changed dramatically because of our example and our work. Young vampires who had once believed they were doomed to eternal loneliness were forming meaningful relationships with humans and other vampires. Ancient vampires who had been trapped in outdated traditions were discovering new ways to find purpose and connection in the modern world. The human world was also beginning to change, though more slowly and carefully. The existence of vampires remained known only to selected government officials and individuals who had direct contact with the supernatural community. But those who did know were learning that vampires were not the monsters of legend, but complex beings capable of both great harm and great good, just like humans. Our territory had become a model for vampire-human cooperation that other regions were beginning to emulate. We had the lowest rates of supernatural violence in North America and the highest levels of successful vampire-human partnerships. Diplomats and researchers from around the world came to study our methods and adapt them to their own circumstances. But beyond the political and social changes we had helped create, the most important transformation was personal. Alexander and I had found in each other not just love, but true partnership. We had become better versions of ourselves through our relationship while maintaining the individual qualities that had attracted us to each other in the first place. 5 years after that fateful night when Alexander Ross first walked into Midnight Diner, I stood before the United Nations General Assembly as the first official ambassador from the supernatural community to the human world. The existence of vampires had been gradually revealed to world leaders over the previous 3 years, and formal diplomatic relations were now being established on a global scale. The speech I gave that day was broadcast around the world, marking the end of centuries of secrecy and the beginning of a new era of cooperation between species. I spoke about the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead, the need for mutual understanding and respect, and the hope that vampires and humans could work together to address problems that neither could solve alone. But more than the political significance of the moment, I was struck by the personal journey that had brought me to that podium. The scared young woman who had once hidden behind a diner counter while her abusive ex-boyfriend threatened her had become a voice for change on the world stage. Alexander was in the audience, of course, along with representatives from vampire territories around the globe. Through our psychic bond, I could feel his pride and love, steady and warm and reassuring. He had supported my decision to take on this role even though it meant spending more time apart, because he understood that our partnership was strong enough to survive the demands of our individual responsibilities. After the speech, we returned to New York and to the penthouse that had become the unofficial headquarters of vampire human diplomacy. The building now housed offices for the various organizations we had established, but the top floor remained our private sanctuary. That evening, as we sat together in the study where I had first learned the truth about Alexander's nature, we reflected on everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. Our love had deepened over the years, growing from the intense attraction and desperate need of our early relationship into something more mature and sustainable. We had learned to balance our individual growth with our shared goals, to support each other through challenges without losing our distinct identities. The psychic bond between us had evolved as well, becoming less overwhelming and more nuanced. We could still share thoughts and emotions when we chose to, but we had also developed the ability to maintain our privacy when we needed it. The connection enhanced our partnership without defining it completely. I had changed in ways that sometimes amazed me. The frightened waitress, who had once been afraid to stand up for herself, had become a confident leader who could negotiate with world leaders and ancient vampires with equal skill. But I had never lost the empathy and determination that had carried me through my darkest moments. Alexander had also transformed in ways that surprised both of us. The lonely vampire king who had ruled through fear and intimidation had become a collaborative leader who built consensus and sought input from others. He had rediscovered his capacity for joy and hope without losing the strength that made him an effective protector. Together, we had created something unprecedented, a partnership that had changed both the vampire and human worlds. We had proven that love could transcend species boundaries, that power could be shared rather than hoarded, and that the most unlikely combinations sometimes created the most beautiful results. The changes we had helped bring about extended far beyond our own relationship. Vampire-human partnerships were becoming more common and more accepted in both communities. Young vampires who had once believed they were doomed to eternal loneliness were finding love and companionship. Humans who discovered the supernatural world were learning that they had choices beyond fear and submission. Our territory remained a model for successful vampire-human cooperation, with the lowest rates of supernatural violence and the highest levels of successful partnerships in the world. Researchers and diplomats continued to study our methods and adapt them to their own circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, we had maintained the love and respect that had brought us together in the first place. Despite all the changes and challenges, despite the demands of leadership and diplomacy, we had never lost sight of what mattered most, our commitment to each other and to the partnership we had built. As I look back on the journey that had brought us to this point, I was struck by how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The basic truth that had drawn us together remained unchanged. We were better together than we were apart, stronger as partners than as individuals, and capable of creating positive change in the world through our love and cooperation. The fearsome vampire king who had rejected countless potential mates had found his perfect partner in a human who had the courage to see past his reputation to the man underneath. And in finding each other, we had both discovered that the strongest love stories were not about changing for someone else, but about becoming the best version of yourself through partnership with someone who truly understood and valued who you were. Our story had become a legend in both the vampire and human worlds, proof that love could overcome any obstacle and that the most unlikely partnerships could create the most profound changes. But to us, it was simply the foundation of a life we had built together, one day at a time, one challenge at a time, one moment of love and trust at a time. The future stretched ahead of us, full of possibilities we could not yet imagine. There would be new challenges to face, new problems to solve, new opportunities to create positive change in the world. But whatever came next, we would face it together as partners and equals, as lovers and allies, as two beings who had found in each other not just love, but the courage to become more than they had ever dreamed possible. And that, I realized, was the most beautiful transformation of all. Now, as I finish telling you this story, I am sitting in the same penthouse study where I first learned that vampires were real, where I first felt the psychic bond that would change my life forever, where I first understood that love could transcend every boundary that society tried to impose. It has been 7 years since that night at Midnight Diner when Alexander Ross first walked into my life. 7 years since I was a desperate waitress running from an abusive ex-boyfriend with no money, no prospects, and no hope for a better future. 7 years since I discovered that the most fearsome vampire king in North America was also the loneliest man I had ever met. Today, I serve as the global ambassador for vampire-human relations, working with governments and supernatural communities around the world to build bridges where once there were only walls. Alexander and I co-rule the most peaceful and prosperous vampire territory in history, where humans and vampires work together as equals rather than predators and prey. But the most important change is not in our circumstances or our responsibilities. It is in the love we have built together day by day, challenge by challenge, moment by moment. Alexander is still the most powerful vampire I have ever known, capable of moving faster than human eyes can follow and commanding their respective creatures who have lived for centuries. But he is also the man who brings me coffee every morning, who listens to my concerns about diplomatic negotiations, who holds me when nightmares about our early battles wake me in the middle of the day. I am still fundamentally human, despite the abilities I have gained through our bond. I still get tired, still worry about the people I love, still sometimes miss the simplicity of my old life. But I am also a woman who has negotiated treaties with ancient vampires, who has survived trials that were designed to kill humans, who has helped create a new world where love matters more than species. Our psychic connection has become as natural as breathing, a constant source of comfort and strength that enhances our partnership without overwhelming our individual identities. We can share thoughts and emotions when we choose to, but we also maintain our privacy and independence. The bond is a bridge between us, not a chain that binds us together. The vampire world has changed dramatically because of our example and our work. Young vampires no longer believe they are doomed to eternal loneliness. Ancient vampires are discovering new purposes and connections in the modern world. The old traditions of fear and domination are giving way to the new models based on cooperation and mutual respect. The human world is also changing, though more slowly and carefully. The existence of vampires is no longer a complete secret, known now to world leaders and carefully selected officials who work with the supernatural community. Those who do know are learning that vampires are not the monsters of legend, but complex beings capable of both great harm and great good. Our story has become a legend in both communities, proof that love can overcome any obstacle and that the most unlikely partnerships can create the most profound changes. But to us, it is simply the foundation of the life we have built together. We have faced challenges that would have destroyed lesser partnerships. We have survived assassination attempts, political upheavals, and the constant pressure of being symbols rather than just individuals. Through it all, we have maintained the love and respect that brought us together in the first place. The future stretches ahead of us, full of possibilities we cannot yet imagine. There will be new challenges to face, new problems to solve, new opportunities to create positive change in the world. But whatever comes next, we will face it together, as partners and equals, as lovers and allies. I often think about that scared young woman who hid behind the diner counter while her ex-boyfriend threatened her. She could never have imagined that her life would lead to this moment, to this love, to this partnership that has changed two worlds. But perhaps that is the most important lesson of our story. You never know when your life is going to change completely. You never know when someone is going to walk through your door and offer you a choice that will transform everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. The fearsome vampire king who had rejected countless potential mates for over 3 centuries finally found his perfect partner in a human who had the courage to see past his reputation to the man underneath. And in finding each other, we both discovered that the strongest love stories are not about changing for someone else, but about becoming the best version of yourself through partnership with someone who truly understands and values who you are. So let me ask you this. If you found yourself in my position, faced with the choice between safety and the unknown, between the familiar and the transformative, what would you choose? Would you have the courage to accept an offer that could change everything, even if you did not know where it would lead? Would you be willing to discover that monsters could be gentle, that power could be shared, that love could transcend every boundary that the world tried to impose? Would you be brave enough to become more than you ever dreamed possible? If this story has touched you, if it has made you think about love and courage and the possibilities that exist when we look past surface appearances to the truth underneath, then I hope you will like this video and subscribe for more stories about love that transcends boundaries. Share your thoughts in the comments about what you would do in my situation, and let me know where you are watching from around the world. Because the most beautiful truth I have learned is this: love is not about finding someone who completes you, but about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. And sometimes the most fearsome hearts hide the gentlest souls.